Picture this. It's November 5th, 1975. 7 men are driving home through the Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona after a long day of logging. The sun has already dipped below the Mogollon Rim, and the ponderosa pines stretch endlessly into the darkness on either side of the dirt road. But, in just a few minutes, one of these men will vanish without a trace. For 5 days, he'll be gone. Completely gone, while search parties scour 56 square miles of wilderness. When he finally returns, disoriented and terrified, his story will challenge everything we think we know about what's possible in this world. Tonight, we're going deep into one of the most documented and controversial disappearances in modern history. A case that involves polygraph tests, federal investigators, and a mystery that still divides believers and skeptics nearly 50 years later. You'll hear about the beam of light that changed everything, the desperate search through Arizona's wilderness, and the 5 missing days that nobody can fully explain. We'll explore what really happened to Travis Walton and why his story continues to haunt the forests of northern Arizona. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let me take you back to a time when the wilderness still held secrets. And sometimes, those secrets reached down from the sky. Prologue: Pines at Night. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of wind moving through tall pines. It's a whisper that's older than memory. The same sound that Native American tribes heard centuries ago as they moved through these mountains. The Mogollon Rim stretches across central Arizona like a great wall of stone and timber, rising from the desert floor into a world of cool air and endless forest. Tonight, we're standing among ponderosa pines that have watched over this land for generations. Their thick bark, furrowed like ancient skin, catches starlight between the branches. The air carries the scent of resin and earth, and if you listen carefully, you can hear the distant call of an owl echoing through the darkness. This is a place where time moves differently, where the modern world feels far away, and the line between the known and unknown becomes thin as morning mist. It's 1975, and in the small logging town of Snowflake, Arizona, most folks are settling in for the night, unaware that somewhere in these forests, something is about to happen that will change everything. Take a deep breath. Let the cool mountain air fill your lungs, because our story begins here, in this timeless place, on what should have been just another ordinary evening. Part 1. Before the Light. Chapter 1. Northern Arizona, 1970s. In 1975, Snowflake, Arizona was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and the rhythm of life moved with the seasons. Founded by Mormon pioneers, it was a town carved out of the high desert, where the mountains met the sky at 5,600 feet above sea level. The air was thin and clean, and on clear mornings, you could see all the way to the San Francisco peaks, rising like sleeping giants against the horizon. This was logging country. The Sitgreaves National Forest stretched for millions of acres around the town, filled with ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and white oak. The trees here grew tall and straight, perfect for the lumber mills that kept small towns like Snowflake alive. Every morning, crews of men would drive their pickup trucks deep into the forest, following dirt roads that wound through canyons and over ridges, to spend their days among the giants. The work was hard, but honest. There's something deeply satisfying about the bite of a chainsaw into wood, the crack and thunder of a massive tree falling exactly where you planned it, the smell of fresh sawdust, the weight of a good day's work in your shoulders and back. These men knew the forest like others. No city streets. Every trail, every clearing, every place where the elk came to drink. But what made this particular autumn different was a contract. The Forest Service had awarded a job to Mike Rogers and his crew. Thin, a section of forest near Turkey Springs, about 15 miles southwest of Snowflake. It was good work, steady pay, but there was pressure too. The contract had deadlines, and if they didn't meet them, there would be penalties. Real money lost. So they'd been working longer days as November arrived, sometimes not heading home until well after dark. The Mogollon Rim can be an unforgiving place when the sun goes down. Temperatures dropping fast, and if you're not careful, these forest roads can become treacherous in the dark. But they knew these woods. They'd been working them for years. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that something else was watching these forests too. Something that had been there long before the first chainsaw ever disturbed the ancient silence of the pines. Chapter 2. The Crew. Mike Rogers was the crew boss, a man who carried responsibility easily on his broad shoulders. At 28, he'd already spent years learning every aspect of the logging business, from reading timber contracts to managing a crew of strong-willed men. He drove a powder blue pickup truck that served as the crew's transportation. And he knew these forest roads like the lines on his own palm. In the back of that truck, bouncing along dirt roads every morning and evening, rode 6 other men. Each had his own reasons for taking this job, his own way of handling the long days and hard work. Travis Walton was 22, the youngest of the crew, thin and wiry, with an intensity in his dark eyes that some people found unsettling. He'd grown up in Snowflake, part of a large family that had deep roots in the area. Travis was curious about everything, the kind of person who'd stop work to examine an unusual rock formation or point out planets in the night sky. He read science fiction books and wondered about life beyond Earth. But he was also practical, good with his hands, reliable with a chainsaw. Ken Peterson was the steady one, methodical in his work, the kind of man you could count on to show up every day regardless of weather. He'd known Mike Rogers for years and trusted his judgment completely. John Gillette brought humor to the long workdays. He had a gift for telling stories that could make the time pass faster during the evening rides home. And he wasn't afraid to voice his opinions about anything from politics to the best way to fell a stubborn tree. Steve Pierce was quieter, more observant. He noticed things others missed, the way the light fell through the trees at different times of day, the tracks that animals left in the soft earth around water sources. Dwayne Smith and Alan Dallas rounded out the crew, each bringing their own skills and personalities to the mix. Dwayne was known for his strength. He could handle timber that would challenge 2 other men. Alan had experience with the business side of logging and often talked with Mike about contracts and deadlines. Together, they formed the kind of crew that logging companies valued. Men who worked well together, who could be trusted to do the job right, even when no supervisor was watching. They developed the easy camaraderie that comes from shared hard work and mutual respect. But crews like this also develop something else, a kind of group intuition, an ability to sense when something isn't quite right. It's a survival skill in dangerous work, this ability to read subtle changes in mood or environment. None of them realized it yet, but this skill would become crucial on the evening of November 5th, when their normal ride home would become anything but normal, as they bounced along those forest roads day after day, sharing jokes and complaints about the work, passing the time until they could get home to warm houses and hot dinners. None of them suspected that they were about to become part of a mystery that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Chapter 3. Travis Walton, a young logger. Travis Walton had always been different. Even as a child growing up in Snowflake, he possessed an intensity, a restless curiosity that set him apart from his peers. While other kids played normal games, Travis would spend hours staring at the night sky, wondering what might be out there among the stars. His family had deep roots in northern Arizona. The Waltons were part of the Mormon pioneer stock that had settled this harsh but beautiful country. People who knew how to work with their hands and make a living from the land. Travis had learned early the value of hard work, but he'd also inherited something else, an openness to possibilities that others might dismiss. At 22, he was lean and strong from years of physical labor, with dark hair and intense eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He moved through the forest with the confidence of someone who'd grown up among these trees, but there was always something searching in his manner, as if he were looking for something just beyond the next ridge. On a typical workday, Travis would be among the first to grab his chainsaw when the crew reached their cutting area. He had good instincts for reading timber, knowing exactly where to make his cuts so a tree would fall cleanly without binding his saw or creating dangerous kickback. The smell of pine resin and sawdust was as familiar to him as the scent of his mother's cooking. During lunch breaks, while the other men talked about hunting or trucks or weekend plans, Travis might pull out a paperback science fiction novel. He was fascinated by stories of other worlds, other forms of life. Some of the crew teased him about it. Here he was, making his living among some of the most spectacular natural beauty on Earth, and he spent his free time reading about distant planets. But Travis didn't see any contradiction in this. The forest was beautiful, absolutely, but it was also familiar. He'd grown up here. He knew every type of tree, every animal track, every seasonal change that transformed the landscape. What captured his imagination was the unknown, the vast universe that stretched beyond the atmosphere, the possibility that Earth might not be alone among the stars. His family and friends in Snowflake had learned to accept this aspect of Travis's personality. He wasn't eccentric exactly, just curious in ways that made some people uncomfortable. He asked questions that others didn't think to ask. He noticed things that others overlooked. On the morning of November 5th, 1975, Travis woke up in his small apartment, feeling the familiar anticipation of another day's work. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the promise of winter, and he could see his breath as he walked to where Mike Rogers would pick him up. It was going to be a long day. They were behind schedule on the Forest Service contract, and Mike wanted to work until they had enough light to see. As Travis climbed into the back of Mike's pickup truck with the rest of the crew, he had no way of knowing that this would be his last normal morning for a very long time. That by evening, he would be gone, vanished so completely that some people would wonder if he had ever existed at all. The truck pulled away from Snowflake as the sun climbed over the Mogollon Rim, heading into the forest where ancient pines waited in their eternal silence. Travis settled back against the truck bed, watching the familiar landscape roll past, unaware that somewhere among those trees, something was waiting that would change his life forever. Chapter 4. The Contract and the Clock. Time was running out, and Mike Rogers felt the weight of it every morning when he looked at his crew. The Forest Service contract they'd taken on was more complex than it had first appeared. Not just cutting timber, but thinning overgrown sections of forest in a very specific way. Every tree had to be marked, every cut had to meet federal guidelines, and every day they fell behind schedule meant money lost. The contract called for clearing 200 acres of mixed pine and oak forest near Turkey Springs. On paper, it had seemed straightforward enough. In reality, the terrain was more challenging than expected. The trees were older and more densely packed, and the weather hadn't cooperated. October had brought early snow flurries that slowed their work, and now November was slipping away faster than they could keep up. Mike had done the math over and over. If they didn't finish by the deadline, the penalties would eat up most of their profit. 7 men depended on this job. 7 families counting on steady paychecks through the winter months when logging work could become scarce. The pressure was real, and it was building with each passing day. This pressure led to a decision that would later seem fateful: working past sunset. Normally, logging crews quit when the light began to fade. Chainsaws and falling trees are dangerous enough in broad daylight, and the forest roads could be treacherous after dark. But desperate times called for desperate measures. "We'll work until we can't see," Mike had told the crew that morning. "Every hour counts now." The men understood. They all knew what was at stake. So they'd been pushing harder, staying later, trying to make up for lost time. It meant long, cold rides home in the dark, bumping along forest roads with only the truck's headlights to guide them. It meant getting home exhausted, eating late dinners, and getting up before dawn to do it all again. But there was something else building in those autumn days of 1975, something none of them could measure or plan for. The forest itself seemed different somehow. More than one crew member had mentioned feeling watched while they worked, though there was never anyone there when they looked up from their saws. The wildlife seemed unusually quiet in certain areas, as if the normal rhythms of the woods had been disrupted by something they couldn't identify. Travis had noticed it too, though he hadn't said much about it. Sometimes, while the others were focused on their cutting, he'd pause and scan the tree line, certain he'd glimpsed movement in his peripheral vision. But there was nothing there, just the endless ranks of ponderosa pines standing in their ancient silence. The deadline was November 10th, 5 days away. Mike had calculated that if they could work until dark every remaining day, they might just make it. They might just save the contract and salvage their season. What none of them knew was that the forest had its own timeline, its own plans for November 5th, and those plans would make their deadline seem utterly insignificant. Part 2. The Encounter. Chapter 5. Dusk on November 5th, 1975. The day had been productive, better than they'd hoped. The crew had made real progress on their section of forest, and for the first time in weeks, Mike Rogers felt a cautious optimism about meeting their deadline. Maybe they could pull this off after all. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red, the temperature started dropping fast. November evenings in the Sitgreaves National Forest don't mess around. Once that sun disappears behind the Mogollon Rim, the air turns sharp and thin, reminding you that winter isn't far away. The crew worked until they could barely see their cut marks, squeezing every possible minute from the failing light. Finally, reluctantly, Mike called it a day. Chainsaws fell silent, and the sudden quiet that followed seemed deeper than usual, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. They gathered their tools with the efficiency of men who'd done this hundreds of times before. Chainsaws secured in the truck bed, gas cans checked, personal gear collected. The routine was comforting in its familiarity, the same ritual that ended every workday, the signal that it was time to head home to warm houses and hot meals. Mike's powder blue pickup truck had seen better days, but it was reliable on these forest roads. The crew piled in, Mike behind the wheel, some in the cab, others in the back bed, despite the cold. They'd done this drive so many times they could probably do it with their eyes closed, out of the cutting area, onto Forest Road 618, then the winding route back toward town. The truck's engine rumbled to life, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. They pulled away from the work site, leaving behind the fresh scent of sawdust and pine resin that marked their progress. Behind them, the forest settled into evening quiet, broken only by the distant call of an owl and the whisper of wind through the trees. But something was different about this particular evening. The men couldn't quite put their finger on it at first. Just a feeling, an unusual quality to the air itself. The darkness seemed deeper somehow, more complete than usual. Even the familiar forest sounds seemed muted, as if the woods were listening for something. Travis rode in the back of the truck, along with several of the other crew members. The cold air cut through his jacket, but he didn't mind. There was something about these evening rides that he'd always enjoyed. The sense of completion, of honest work done, of heading home through country that still held mysteries despite his lifetime of exploring it. As they bounced along Forest Road 618, following the twin beams of the headlights through the tunnel of overhanging branches, none of them suspected that they were about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the world. The truck rounded a familiar bend, and that's when Ken Peterson, riding in the cab, noticed something unusual ahead. Through the trees, off to the right of the road, there was a glow. Not the warm, flickering light of a campfire, and definitely not the steady beam of vehicle headlights. This was something else entirely, a pale, ethereal luminescence that seemed to hover among the pines. "Mike," Ken said quietly, "you seeing that light up there?" Mike slowed the truck, following Ken's gaze through the passenger window. The other men began to notice it too, heads turning toward the strange glow that seemed to pulse and shift among the trees. It was beautiful in a way, and deeply unsettling at the same time. The truck came to a stop. The engine idled roughly in the cold air, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. They all stared at the light, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. It definitely wasn't natural. No phosphorescent log or reflection of starlight could create that kind of steady, purposeful illumination. but it wasn't moving like an aircraft either. It simply hung there among the trees, about 100 yards off the road, glowing with a soft, almost hypnotic intensity that drew the eye and held it. "What do you think it is?" someone whispered. Nobody had an answer, but they all knew, with the certainty that comes from years of working in the wilderness, that they were looking at something that didn't belong in their familiar world of chainsaws and timber contracts and evening drives home. Something that would, in just a few moments, change all of their lives forever. Chapter 6. Approaching the object. Mike Rogers eased the truck off the road, pulling into a small clearing where they could get a better look at whatever was creating that strange glow. The engine's idle seemed unnaturally loud in the forest, quiet, competing with the sound of 7 men breathing in the cold air, each trying to process what they were seeing. The light was clearer now, more defined. It wasn't just a glow among the trees. It was something solid, something with shape and substance. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness beyond the truck's headlights, they could make out a form that defied easy description. It appeared to be hovering just above the forest floor, perhaps 15 feet off the ground, nestled in a small clearing among the ponderosa pines. The object itself was disc-shaped, maybe 20 feet across, with a kind of metallic sheen that caught and reflected the pale light emanating from its surface. But the light wasn't harsh or blinding. It had an almost organic quality, pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat. The whole thing seemed to shimmer slightly, as if it weren't quite solid, as if it existed in some space between the physical world and something else entirely. For several minutes, nobody moved. They sat in the truck, engine running, staring at this impossible thing that had appeared in their familiar forest. The silence stretched between them, heavy with disbelief and a growing sense that they were witnessing something that would be very difficult to explain to anyone who wasn't there. Travis was the first to break the spell. Without warning, he opened the truck's tailgate and dropped to the ground. The sound of his boots hitting earth seemed to snap the others out of their trance. "Travis, what are you doing?" Mike called from the cab. But Travis was already walking toward the tree line, drawn by a curiosity that overwhelmed any sense of caution. This was exactly the kind of moment he dreamed about, wondered about, read about in his science fiction novels. Here, in the forest, where he'd spent his entire life, something extraordinary was actually happening. "Travis, get back here!" The voices of his crewmates seemed to come from very far away as he moved through the trees toward the object. Each step took him further from the safety of the truck, deeper into the pale glow that seemed to embrace him as he approached. Up close, the object was even more mysterious. The surface appeared to be seamless, without any obvious seams or joints, as if it had been formed rather than built. The light emanated from the entire structure, not from any particular source he could identify. And now he could hear something. Not quite a sound, but a vibration that seemed to resonate in his chest. A frequency just at the edge of perception. The air around the object felt different somehow. Thicker, maybe, or charged with some kind of energy that made the hair on his arms stand up beneath his jacket. He could smell something too. Ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, mixed with something else he couldn't identify. Behind him, His crewmates were shouting for him to come back, their voices growing more urgent. But Travis felt drawn forward, compelled to get closer to this incredible thing that had appeared in his world. He had to know what it was, had to understand what he was looking at. He was perhaps 30 feet away when the object began to change. The gentle pulsing of its light quickened, becoming more intense, more focused. The vibration he'd been feeling grew stronger, and now there was definitely a sound. A low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The object started to move. Not dramatically, just a slight rotation, as if it were becoming aware of his presence. And then, from somewhere on its underside, a beam of light erupted downward with startling intensity. Travis had just enough time to think that this was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The beam was pure, brilliant white, like concentrated starlight, and it reached down toward him with what seemed like deliberate intent. When it touched him, the world exploded into light and sensation. And then, nothing. The last thing Travis Walton remembered was the sound of his own voice, crying out in wonder and terror, echoing through the ancient pines of the Sitgreaves National Forest. Chapter 7. Flight, Return, and Loss. The beam struck Travis with the force of lightning, lifting him off his feet and hurling him backward through the air. In the truck, 6 men watched in horror as their friend and crewmate was thrown 10 feet by a force none of them could comprehend. He hit the ground hard and lay motionless, a dark shape against the pale glow still emanating from the hovering object. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" someone was saying, over and over, the words barely audible over the sound of the truck's engine and their own thundering heartbeats. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. The object continued to hover, its light pulsing more rapidly now, as if responding to what had just happened. Travis lay where he'd fallen, silent and still, and the men in the truck struggled to process what they'd just witnessed. Then panic took over. "Drive! Drive! Get us out of here!" The voices came from multiple directions at once, overlapping in their terror. Mike Rogers, his hands shaking, threw the truck into gear and pressed the accelerator. The pickup lurched forward, tires spinning in the forest dirt, and within seconds, they were racing down Forest Road 618, leaving Travis behind in that clearing, with whatever that thing was. They drove hard for maybe a mile before guilt and loyalty overwhelmed their fear. These were not cowards. They were working men who understood the bonds of crew, who would never abandon a friend in normal circumstances. But nothing about this situation was normal. "We have to go back," Mike said, his voice tight with strain. "We can't leave Travis." The truck slowed, turned around, and began the agonizing drive back toward the clearing. Their headlights swept the familiar trees, but everything looked different now, alien and threatening. The forest that had been their workplace, their second home, now felt hostile and strange. When they reached the spot where they'd seen the object, it was gone. The clearing stood empty, just another patch of forest floor among the pines. No strange light, no hovering disk, no evidence that anything unusual had ever been there, and no Travis. They called his name until their voices went hoarse, splitting up to search different directions with flashlights. The beams of light danced frantically among the trees, illuminating nothing but bark and brush and the confused tracks of their own boots. The forest had swallowed their friend as completely as if he'd never existed. The temperature was dropping fast, and their breath made white clouds in the beam of the flashlights. If Travis was injured, if he was lying unconscious somewhere in these woods, he might not survive the night. The thought drove them to search longer, harder, calling his name until the sound echoed uselessly among the silent pines. But Travis Walton was gone. Not hiding, not injured and crawling toward safety, not confused and wandering in circles. Gone, as if he'd been erased from the world. The only evidence he'd ever been there were the tire tracks from Mike's truck and their own footprints in the soft earth. Finally, faced with a situation beyond anything their experience had prepared them for, they made the hardest decision of their lives. They drove back to Snowflake to report what had happened, knowing that no one would believe them, knowing that their story sounded impossible, even to themselves. As Mike Rogers's powder blue pickup truck disappeared down the dark forest road, carrying 6 traumatized men toward a town that would never quite believe their story, the Sitgreaves National Forest settled back into its ancient silence. Whatever had taken Travis Walton had left no trace, no sign, no clue about where he might have gone. But somewhere among those sleeping pines, in a place beyond the reach of flashlights and search parties, Travis Walton was beginning an experience that would challenge everything human beings thought they knew about their place in the universe. The question that would haunt investigators, skeptics, and believers for decades was simple. Where was he? And perhaps more importantly, who or what had taken him? Part 3. The 5 Days, Chapter 8. Night Search and First Reports. Sheriff Marlon Gillespie had been in law enforcement in Navajo County long enough to think he'd heard every possible story. Domestic disputes, bar fights, hunting accidents, the occasional case of someone getting lost in the wilderness. These were the problems he was equipped to handle. But when 6 shaken men showed up at his office just before midnight on November 5th, claiming that their friend had been struck by a beam of light from a flying saucer and then vanished, he found himself in completely uncharted territory. Mike Rogers did most of the talking, his voice steady but strained as he recounted what they'd witnessed. The other crew members sat or stood around the small office, still dirty from their day's work, their faces showing the shock of men who'd seen something that didn't fit into their understanding of the world. Gillespie listened without interruption, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. He'd known some of these men for years. They weren't troublemakers or attention seekers. Mike Rogers, in particular, had a reputation for reliability and honesty, but their story was beyond anything in the sheriff's experience, and his first instinct was to look for a simpler explanation. "Now, you boys haven't been drinking, have you?" he asked, though he could see from their clear eyes and steady voices that alcohol wasn't a factor. "No, sir," Mike replied. "We were working late, trying to finish that Forest Service contract. We were all stone sober." Gillespie studied the men's faces. Whatever they thought they'd seen, they clearly believed it had happened exactly as they described. But belief and reality weren't always the same thing, especially when people were tired, stressed, and working in poor light conditions. Still, Travis Walton was missing. Whatever these men thought they'd witnessed, a real person had disappeared in the forest, and that required a real response. The sheriff organized an immediate search party, calling in deputies and volunteers who knew the area well. By 2 a.m., 15 men with flashlights and portable radios were combing the forest around Turkey Springs. The night was cold and clear, with enough starlight to make navigation possible, but searching for a missing person in the wilderness at night was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of several counties. The searchers called Travis's name and listened for any response, but the forest answered only with silence. They found the tire tracks from Mike's truck and the trampled ground where the crew had searched earlier, but no sign of Travis himself. No blood, no torn clothing, no indication of which direction he might have gone. As dawn broke over the Mogollon Rim, the search expanded. Arizona. Department of Public Safety brought in more personnel and equipment. The Forest Service provided maps and local knowledge. Word spread through Snowflake and the surrounding communities, and volunteers began arriving to help with the search. But volunteers also brought something else. Questions. The story Mike Rogers and his crew were telling spread through the small community like wildfire, growing and changing with each retelling. Some people focused on the fact that a man was missing and needed to be found. Others became fixated on the more extraordinary aspects of the account. By the second day, reporters were starting to call. By the third day, the first news vans were pulling into Snowflake. A missing person case was becoming something much more complicated. A media event, a source of speculation and controversy that would soon reach far beyond the borders of rural Arizona. The forest, meanwhile, kept its secrets. Search teams covered hundreds of square miles, following every trail, checking every clearing, investigating every possible shelter where an injured man might have taken refuge. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the endless expanse of pine and oak, their rotors disturbing the ancient quiet of the wilderness. But the Sitgreaves National Forest is vast. Over 1.8 million acres of rugged country where a person could disappear without a trace under perfectly normal circumstances. Finding someone in that immensity would be challenging, even with the best possible conditions and unlimited resources. And the circumstances surrounding Travis Walton's disappearance were far from normal. The story his crewmates told seemed to rule out conventional search methods. If Travis had indeed been taken by something not of this world, then traditional tracking and search techniques might be useless. Sheriff Gillespie found himself caught between his duty to conduct a thorough investigation and his growing certainty that this case was unlike anything in his experience. The physical evidence was limited to tire tracks and footprints. The witness testimony was consistent, but extraordinary. And with each passing hour, the chances of finding Travis Walton alive were diminishing. By the morning of November 8th, 3 days after Travis had vanished, the official search was winding down. The volunteers were going home. The helicopters were returning to base, and the media attention was beginning to focus less on finding a missing man and more on whether his friends were telling the truth. But the questions were just beginning. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of northern Arizona, Travis Walton remained missing, leaving behind only mysteries and a story that seemed too strange to believe, but too detailed and consistent to easily dismiss. Chapter 9. Suspicion. By the fourth day, the whispers had started. In a small town like Snowflake, rumors travel faster than wildfire, and the story Mike Rogers and his crew were telling had grown more controversial with each retelling. What had begun as a search for a missing man was transforming into something much more complicated. A test of belief, trust, and the limits of what people were willing to accept as possible. The whispers came in different forms, but they all carried the same underlying doubt. In coffee shops and grocery stores, at church meetings and school pickup lines, people began asking questions that had nothing to do with finding Travis Walton. Instead, they focused on the men who claimed to have witnessed his disappearance. "Do you really believe that story?" became the question that divided the community. Some people, especially those who knew the crew members personally, defended their honesty and character. These men had families, jobs, reputations in the community. Why would they risk all of that with such an outlandish tale? But others weren't so sure. The story was just too convenient, too perfectly timed. Here was a logging crew that was behind schedule on an important contract, facing significant financial penalties if they didn't finish on time. And suddenly, one of their workers disappears in a way that makes it impossible to continue the job. The Forest Service would have to extend their deadline under these circumstances. It was the only reasonable thing to do. Could this be an elaborate hoax designed to save their contract? The theory gained traction among the skeptics, even though it required believing that 7 men would conspire to fake something this dramatic, this public, this likely to bring unwanted attention to their lives. Sheriff Gillespie found himself dealing with 2 separate investigations. The official search for Travis continued, but he also had to consider the possibility that no crime had been committed, that Travis was hiding somewhere voluntarily, while his friends told an increasingly elaborate story to cover for him. The crew members were interviewed separately, their stories examined for inconsistencies. But this is where the skeptics encountered their first major problem. The accounts were remarkably consistent. 6 different men, interviewed at different times by different officers, told essentially the same story. The details matched, the timeline was coherent, and none of them seemed to be coordinating their responses. Mike Rogers, as the crew leader, faced the most intense scrutiny. He had the most to lose financially if the contract failed, giving him the strongest motive for any potential deception. But when investigators examined his background, they found a man with no history of dishonesty, no financial problems that would drive him to desperate measures, and no apparent reason to risk his reputation on such an unlikely scheme. Ken Peterson, John Gillette, Steve Pierce, Dwayne Smith, and Alan Dallas each faced similar scrutiny. Their backgrounds were examined, their relationships investigated, their potential motives questioned. But the picture that emerged was of ordinary working men who had stumbled into an extraordinary situation, not conspirators in an elaborate hoax. Still, the suspicion persisted. Law enforcement officers who had seen their share of human deception found it easier to believe in a coordinated lie than in flying saucers and beams of light. The story violated too many fundamental assumptions about how the world worked to be easily accepted, no matter how sincere the witnesses appeared to be. As the days passed without any sign of Travis, a darker theory began to emerge. What if something had happened to Travis? Not something involving extraterrestrials, but something much more earthly and sinister. What if the crew's story was designed to cover up a more conventional crime? This theory was harder to dismiss than the hoax hypothesis. Men working in remote locations with dangerous equipment had opportunities for accidents, arguments, even violence. The forest provided plenty of places to hide a body. And a story about alien abduction might be exactly the kind of misdirection that would keep investigators from looking too closely at more mundane explanations. The crew members found themselves in an impossible position. They were grieving the loss of their friend and crewmate, traumatized by what they claimed to have witnessed, and now facing suspicion that they were either liars or killers. The stress showed on their faces during interviews, but stress could indicate guilt just as easily as innocence. The investigation expanded to include careful examination of the work site, looking for any evidence of violence or struggle. Investigators checked the crew's tools for bloodstains, searched their vehicles and homes, interviewed family members and friends. They were looking for anything that might support the theory that Travis Walton had met with foul play at the hands of his co-workers. But they found nothing. No physical evidence of violence, no history of conflict between Travis and the other crew members, no indication that any of them had reason to harm him. If this was a murder, it was one committed by men with no apparent motive and executed so perfectly that it left no trace. Meanwhile, the media attention was intensifying. National news outlets had picked up the story, and reporters were descending on Snowflake like locusts. The small town wasn't equipped to handle this kind of scrutiny, and the constant presence of cameras and microphones was adding stress to an already strained situation. The crew members found themselves thrust into a spotlight they'd never wanted, forced to tell their story over and over to skeptical reporters and investigators. Each retelling was examined for inconsistencies, each detail questioned and challenged. The men who had simply been trying to make a living in the forest were now the subjects of a media circus that seemed to grow larger and more intrusive every day. And through it all, Travis Walton remained missing. Whether he was the victim of an otherworldly encounter, an elaborate hoax, or something more sinister, he was gone. His family waited for news, his community struggled with doubt and belief, and his friends faced questions that grew more pointed and accusatory with each passing day. The forest, indifferent to human drama and speculation, kept its secrets locked away among the ancient pines. Chapter 10. Polygraph Tests. On November 10th, 5 days after Travis had vanished, Sheriff Gillespie made a decision that would add another layer of controversy to an already complex case. He arranged for the crew members to take polygraph tests, hoping that the results might provide some clarity about what had really happened in the forest. Polygraph examinations, commonly known as lie detector tests, measure physiological responses that are associated with stress and deception. When a person lies, their body typically responds with increased heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, and skin conductivity. The theory is that these involuntary responses can betray deception, even when a person appears calm and confident on the surface. But polygraph tests are not infallible. They measure stress, not truth, and stress can have many causes. An innocent person who feels accused and defensive might show responses that suggest deception. A skilled liar who remains calm might pass with flying colors. This is why polygraph results are rarely admissible in court. They're considered too unreliable to be used as evidence. Still, law enforcement agencies often use them as investigative tools, hoping that the results might point them in the right direction or encourage subjects to be more forthcoming with information. The crew members agreed to take the tests, though they weren't legally required to do so. For men who insisted they were telling the truth, refusal might have looked like evidence of guilt. But agreeing to the examination meant submitting to a process that could brand them as liars, even if they were being completely honest. The tests were administered by Cy Gilson, an experienced polygraph examiner who had worked with law enforcement agencies throughout Arizona. Gilson was known for his thoroughness and objectivity. If anyone could get reliable results from these examinations, it was him. The process was methodical and stress-inducing. Each man was tested separately, connected to sensors that monitored their physiological responses, while Gilson asked a series of carefully prepared questions. Some were control questions, designed to establish baseline responses. Others went directly to the heart of the matter. Did you see Travis Walton get struck by a beam of light from an unidentified object? Do you know what happened to Travis Walton? Are you lying about the events of November 5th? The sensors traced patterns on moving paper, creating a permanent record of each man's bodily responses to these crucial questions. Gilson watched the tracings carefully, looking for the telltale signs that might indicate deception. When the examinations were complete, the results were both surprising and problematic. 5 of the 6 crew members, Mike Rogers, Ken Peterson, John Goulet, Steve Pierce, and Dwayne Smith, passed their polygraph tests conclusively. According to the examiner's interpretation, these men showed no signs of deception when they described the events of November 5th. They appeared to be telling the truth as they understood it. Alan Dallas, however, produced inconclusive results. His responses showed patterns that could indicate deception, but they could also indicate extreme stress, fear, or other emotional factors unrelated to dishonesty. The test couldn't determine whether he was lying or simply overwhelmed by the situation. These results created new questions rather than providing answers. If 5 men were telling the truth about witnessing something extraordinary, what did that mean for the investigation? Could they all be sincere but mistaken about what they'd seen? Could mass hallucination explain their shared experience? Skeptics pointed out that polygraph tests could be beaten by people who knew how to control their physiological responses, or by individuals who had convinced themselves that their false story was true. The tests proved only that most of the crew members believed their own account, not that their account was accurate. Believers, on the other hand, saw the results as vindication. Here was scientific evidence that these men weren't lying about one of the most extraordinary claims in modern history. If they were telling the truth about seeing Travis struck by a beam of light, then perhaps the rest of their story deserved serious consideration as well. But the inconclusive result for Alan Dallas troubled everyone involved. Why would one member of the crew show different responses than the others? Was he hiding something? Or was he simply more stressed by the examination process? The ambiguous result cast a shadow over the otherwise clear findings. Law enforcement officials found themselves in a difficult position. The polygraph results suggested that most of the crew members were being truthful, but truthfulness didn't necessarily mean accuracy. People could sincerely believe they had witnessed something that hadn't actually happened, especially under stressful conditions and poor lighting. The tests also raised questions about the nature of the investigation itself. If these men weren't lying about their extraordinary claims, then traditional police work might be inadequate to solve the case. How do you investigate an alien abduction? What kind of evidence would be meaningful in such a case? As news of the polygraph results spread, the media attention intensified even further. Reporters who had been skeptical of the crew's story found themselves forced to consider that these men might actually believe what they were saying. The story was becoming more complex, more nuanced, and more difficult to dismiss as simple fraud or delusion. But the most important question remained unanswered. Where was Travis Walton? Whether the crew members were lying, mistaken, or telling the absolute truth about what they'd witnessed, a real person was still missing. And with each passing day, the chances of finding him alive were growing smaller. The forest, indifferent to polygraph tests and media speculation, continued to guard its secrets among the silent pines. Chapter 11. Travis Returns. The call came at 12:05 a.m. on November 11th, 6 days after Travis Walton had vanished into the forest. Grant Neff, who ran a gas station in Heber, was closing up for the night when his payphone rang. He almost didn't answer. Who calls a gas station after midnight? But something made him pick up the receiver. The voice on the other end was weak, confused, barely recognizable. "This is Travis Walton. I'm at the Heber payphone. Please come get me." Neff knew Travis and his family, but this voice didn't sound like the young man he remembered. It was strained, exhausted, filled with a kind of desperate bewilderment that sent chills down his spine. Still, he agreed to make the call that would bring this extraordinary case to its next phase. Within minutes, Dwayne Walton, Travis's older brother, was racing through the night toward Heber. He'd spent 6 days imagining the worst, fearing that he might never see his brother again. The possibility that Travis was alive, that he was coming home, seemed almost too good to believe. When Dwayne arrived at the gas station, he found Travis huddled near the payphone, wearing the same clothes he'd disappeared in 6 days earlier. But the man waiting for him looked like he'd aged years in less than a week. Travis was pale, disoriented, and 20 pounds lighter than when he'd vanished. His eyes held a haunted quality that his family had never seen before. "Travis? Travis, are you okay?" Dwayne helped his brother into the truck, noting how he seemed to flinch at sudden movements and sounds. Travis was clearly in shock, barely responsive to questions, mumbling fragmentary answers that didn't quite make sense. The drive back to Snowflake was surreal. Here was the man whose disappearance had triggered the largest search operation in the area's history, whose case had attracted national media attention and divided an entire community. And he was sitting in a pickup truck, alive but clearly traumatized, unable to explain where he'd been for nearly a week. Dr. Joseph Candle, a physician in Snowflake, examined Travis that night. The young man was severely dehydrated, exhausted, and showed signs of significant weight loss. But there were no obvious injuries, no indication of physical trauma that might explain his condition. It was as if he'd simply been elsewhere for 6 days, without food or adequate water. During the initial examination, Travis was largely uncommunicative. He seemed confused about how much time had passed, at first insisting that he'd only been gone for a few hours. When his family explained that 6 days had elapsed, that massive search parties had been looking for him, that his disappearance had become national news, he appeared genuinely shocked. The reunion with his family was emotional, but strange. Travis clearly recognized his loved ones, but he seemed distant, disconnected, as if part of him were still somewhere else. He kept asking about the time, about the date, as if he couldn't quite believe how much time had passed without his awareness. Sheriff Gillespie arrived at the Walton home within hours of Travis's return. The law enforcement officer had spent nearly a week dealing with one of the most unusual cases of his career, and now the missing person was back. But rather than providing answers, Travis's return only generated more questions. In his initial interviews with police, Travis was vague about what had happened to him. He remembered walking toward the object in the forest, remembered the beam of light, and then fragments, disconnected images and sensations that didn't form a coherent narrative. He seemed genuinely confused about his own experience, as if important memories were just beyond his reach. Dr. Candle recommended that Travis be allowed to rest and recover before undergoing extensive questioning. The young man was clearly in a fragile state, and pushing him too hard, too soon, might not yield reliable information. But the pressure for answers was enormous, both from law enforcement and from the media that had been following the case. News of Travis's return spread quickly through Snowflake and beyond. Reporters who had been camping out in the small town for days suddenly had a new focus for their attention. The man at the center of the mystery was back, and everyone wanted to know where he'd been. But Travis Walton wasn't ready to tell that story. Not yet. He spent his first day back sleeping, eating small amounts of food, and gradually readjusting to the familiar surroundings of his family's home. His loved ones could see that something profound had happened to him, something that had left psychological scars, even if there were no obvious physical injuries. The crew members who had reported his disappearance were relieved, but also apprehensive. Their friend was back, which vindicated their decision to report what they'd seen rather than trying to cover it up. But they also knew that Travis's return would intensify scrutiny of their story. If he couldn't remember what had happened to him, would people believe that anything extraordinary had occurred at all? The forest that had harbored this mystery for 6 days had given up its secret, but only partially. Travis Walton was home, but the questions about where he'd been and what had happened to him were just beginning. And when he finally felt ready to tell his story, it would prove to be even more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The silent pines of the Sitgreaves National Forest continued their ancient vigil, holding whatever other secrets might lie hidden among their shadows. Part 4. Inside the Story. Chapter 12. Travis's Account. The Craft. It took several days before Travis felt ready to share what he remembered about his 5 missing days. When he finally began to speak, his account would become one of the most detailed and controversial abduction stories ever recorded. Whether people believed him or not, the specificity and consistency of his memories would fuel debates for decades to come. Travis's recollections began with fragmented images, like pieces of a dream that slowly coalesced into something more coherent. He remembered the beam of light striking him, remembered falling backward, and then darkness, but not the peaceful darkness of sleep or unconsciousness. This was something different, something that felt vast and empty and wrong. When awareness returned, he found himself lying on his back on what felt like a hard, smooth surface. The air around him was warm and humid, with a quality he'd never experienced before. Thick, almost oppressive, as if it carried more oxygen than normal atmosphere. There was a smell, too, medicinal and chemical, like a hospital, but somehow more sterile, more artificial. As his vision cleared, Travis realized he was looking up at a curved, dome-like ceiling that glowed with soft, amber light. The surface appeared to be seamless, without any obvious source for the illumination. It simply emerged from the material itself, creating a gentle, diffused radiance that filled the space without casting shadows. He tried to sit up and immediately felt dizzy, nauseated. His body felt weak, drained, as if he'd been unconscious for much longer than the few hours he thought had passed. When he finally managed to raise himself on his elbows, he could see that he was in a small, circular room, perhaps 8 feet across. The walls curved smoothly into the ceiling, creating an egg-like interior space that felt both intimate and confining. Like the ceiling, the walls seemed to generate their own light, though it was dimmer near the floor. The surface appeared to be made of some material he couldn't identify. Not metal, not plastic, but something that seemed almost organic in its smooth perfection. There was no obvious door, no seams or joints that might indicate how he'd entered the space. The room felt sealed, isolated, as if it existed in some pocket dimension, separate from the normal world. The silence was complete. No mechanical sounds, no ventilation, no indication of activity beyond these curved walls. As Travis struggled to orient himself, he became aware that he wasn't alone. Movement in his peripheral vision made him turn, and that's when he saw them for the first time. 3 small figures stood near. What he now realized was an opening in the wall, a doorway that had appeared silently while his attention was focused elsewhere. The beings were perhaps 4 feet tall, with large heads that seemed disproportionate to their slender bodies. Their skin was pale, almost luminescent in the amber light, and their eyes were enormous, dark, liquid, and utterly alien in their intensity. They wore no clothing that he could identify, their forms seeming to flow seamlessly from head to toe without obvious joints or muscular definition. Those eyes held him transfixed. They seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if they could see not just his physical form, but something deeper, his thoughts, his memories, his essential nature. There was an intelligence there that was unmistakably real, but it was so foreign, so unlike human consciousness, that it made him feel profoundly alone despite their presence. Travis tried to speak, to ask where he was, what they wanted, but no sound emerged from his throat. Whether this was due to physical weakness or some kind of external control, he couldn't tell. The beings didn't respond to his attempts at communication anyway. They simply observed him, with those vast, dark eyes, as if he were a specimen they were studying. Panic began to build in his chest. Whatever was happening to him, wherever he was, it was clear that he had no control over the situation. He was completely at the mercy of these strange beings in their impossible room. The civilized, rational part of his mind tried to find explanations. Drugs, hallucination, some kind of elaborate prank. But his instincts told him that this was real, that he was farther from home than he'd ever imagined possible. One of the beings moved closer, extending what might have been an arm toward his face. Travis tried to pull away, but his body responded sluggishly, as if he were moving through thick liquid. Something was placed over his nose and mouth, a mask or breathing apparatus of some kind, and the world began to fade around the edges. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him again was those enormous eyes watching him with an expression he couldn't interpret. Was it curiosity? Compassion? Scientific detachment? He would never be certain, but the image would haunt his dreams for years to come. When awareness returned the next time, Travis found himself in a different place entirely. The small, curved room was gone, replaced by something larger and more complex. And this time, he would discover that his captors weren't the only ones aboard this impossible craft. But that part of his story would prove even more difficult for skeptics to accept, even more challenging to conventional understanding of what might be possible in our universe. Travis Walton's account was about to take an even stranger turn. When consciousness returned this time, Travis found himself in what could only be described as a much larger room. The oppressive, egg-like chamber was gone, replaced by a space that felt more open, more sophisticated. The lighting here was different too. Brighter, whiter, more like natural sunlight than the amber glow of the previous room. He was lying on what seemed to be an examination table, though it was unlike any medical furniture he'd ever seen. The surface was smooth and warm, seeming to conform to his body in a way that was both comfortable and unsettling. When he tried to sit up, he found that his strength had returned somewhat, though he still felt weak and disoriented. As his vision cleared, Travis became aware of movement around him. But these weren't the small, large-eyed beings he'd encountered before. These figures were different, taller, more human-like in their proportions. They stood perhaps 5.5 to 6 feet tall, with more familiar body shapes, though their features were still clearly not human. Their skin had a pale, almost translucent quality, and their faces, while recognizably humanoid, possessed an otherworldly perfection that was both beautiful and disturbing. Their eyes were large, but not as overwhelmingly so as the smaller beings, and they seemed to convey more emotion, more recognizable intelligence. These beings wore what appeared to be form-fitting garments that seemed to be made from a single piece of material. The clothing, if it could be called that, covered them from neck to feet in a seamless sheath that appeared to be part fabric, part technology. The material seemed to shift and flow as they moved, as if it were alive. One of the beings approached him, and for the first time since his ordeal began, Travis felt something other than pure terror. There was something in this being's manner that seemed less clinical, less alien than the smaller creatures. When it looked at him, he sensed something that might have been compassion, or at least a kind of benevolent interest. The being didn't speak, at least not with words. But somehow Travis understood that he was meant to follow. His legs felt unsteady as he slid off the table, but he managed to walk. The being led him across the room toward what appeared to be a wall. But as they approached, a section of it became transparent, revealing a corridor beyond. They walked through hallways that seemed to extend much further than the craft he'd seen in the forest should have been able to contain. The walls glowed with the same soft, even light as the rooms, and the floors felt warm beneath his feet. Everything was curved, organic, as if the entire structure had been grown rather than built. Eventually, they entered another large room, and this one took Travis's breath away. One entire wall was transparent, offering a view that defied comprehension. Beyond the clear surface lay space itself. Not the familiar night sky seen from Earth, but the profound darkness of the void, pierced by stars that burned with an intensity he'd never imagined. And Earth hung in that darkness like a blue and white jewel, beautiful and impossibly distant. Travis stared at his home planet, trying to process what he was seeing. If this view was real, then he was far from the forests of Arizona, far from anything that could be explained by conventional understanding. The being who had led him here seemed to understand his shock. It guided him to what appeared to be a control station of some kind, a curved surface covered with symbols and indicators that pulsed with soft light. When the being touched certain areas of this surface, the view beyond the transparent wall changed. Stars wheeled past as if they were moving at incredible speed, though Travis felt no sensation of motion. Stellar patterns shifted and rearranged themselves, and occasionally other objects became visible, structures that might have been other craft, though they were unlike anything from human imagination. At one point, the view focused on what appeared to be a star map, a three-dimensional display that showed the relationships between various stellar systems. The being seemed to be showing him something specific, highlighting certain stars and the paths between them. Travis couldn't understand the significance of what he was seeing, but he sensed that it was important, that he was being given information for reasons he couldn't grasp. Time seemed elastic during this experience. Sometimes it felt like he'd been watching the star display for hours. Other times it seemed like only minutes had passed. His normal sense of temporal flow had been disrupted, leaving him adrift in a present that didn't connect properly to past or future. The being eventually led him to another area where he was given something to eat, or at least something that seemed intended as food. It was unlike anything he'd ever tasted, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but somehow perfectly nourishing. He ate without questioning, his body craving sustenance, even as his mind struggled to process his impossible situation. Throughout all of this, the beings treated him with what seemed like courtesy, even kindness. They didn't communicate through words, but somehow their intentions were clear. He was not a prisoner exactly, but neither was he free to leave. He was a guest of sorts, though the nature of the hospitality was beyond his understanding, as what he assumed were days passed, though the lack of normal day-night cycles made it impossible to be certain. Travis began to sense that his time aboard the craft was coming to an end. The beings seemed to be preparing for something, engaging in activities that suggested change, movement, conclusion. When the end came, it was sudden and disorienting. he found himself back in a smaller room, lying on another table-like surface. The human-like beings were gone, replaced once again by the smaller, large-eyed creatures. One of them approached with what appeared to be a mask or breathing apparatus. As the device was placed over his face, Travis felt consciousness slipping away once more. But this time, there was a quality to the darkness that felt different. Not the alien unconsciousness he'd experienced before, but something more like natural sleep, tinged with the promise of return. When he next opened his eyes, he was lying on cold asphalt beside a payphone in Heber, Arizona. The stars above him were the familiar constellations of Earth's night sky, and the air carried the sharp, clean scent of the high desert. He was home, though he would never be quite the same again. Chapter 13. The Town Reacts. Travis Walton's return to Snowflake was like a stone thrown into still water. The ripples of reaction spread outward in ever-widening circles, affecting not just his family and friends, but the entire community, and eventually, the wider world. The small Mormon town had never experienced anything like the attention that now focused on its quiet streets and ordinary residents. The first reaction was relief, pure and simple. Whatever people believed about the circumstances of his disappearance, Travis was alive and home. And that mattered more than any theory or explanation. His family had been through 6 days of hell, not knowing whether they'd ever see him again, and his return felt like a miracle regardless of how it had happened. But relief quickly gave way to more complex emotions as Travis began to share his account of where he'd been. The story he told was so extraordinary, so far beyond the normal range of human experience, that it challenged every assumption about reality that most people held. How do you process the claim that your neighbor, someone you've known all his life, has been aboard an alien spacecraft? The community found itself divided in ways that no one had anticipated. Families disagreed across dinner tables. Friends found themselves on opposite sides of an impossible question, and longtime neighbors began to view each other with suspicion and doubt. It wasn't just about whether Travis was telling the truth. It was about what it meant for everyone's understanding of the world if he was. At the Snowflake Diner, the morning coffee gatherings that had always been friendly social occasions became tense discussions about the nature of reality itself. Some people defended Travis passionately, pointing to his character, his family's reputation, the consistency of his story. Others remained skeptical, suggesting that the trauma of whatever had really happened had affected his memory and perception. "I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper," said one longtime resident. "He's not a liar, and he's not crazy. If he says something happened to him, then something happened." But another voice would counter, "Something happened, sure enough. But that doesn't mean it was a little green man. Maybe he got hurt. Maybe he got confused. There's lots of ways a person can go missing for a few days without aliens being involved." The local Mormon ward found itself dealing with theological questions it had never faced before. If Travis's account was true, what did it mean for their understanding of God's creation? Were there other forms of intelligent life in the universe? How did that fit with their religious beliefs? Some found ways to incorporate the possibility into their faith, while others saw it as a challenge to fundamental doctrines. The media attention that had been building during Travis's disappearance now exploded into a full-scale invasion. Reporters from national television networks, major newspapers, and magazines descended on Snowflake like a plague of locusts. Camera crews set up on Main Street, satellite trucks filled the small town's parking lots, and journalists knocked on doors at all hours, seeking interviews with anyone who knew Travis or his family. For a community that valued privacy and quiet living, the media circus was deeply traumatic. People who had never spoken to a reporter in their lives found microphones thrust in their faces, their casual comments about their neighbor's experience broadcast to millions of viewers. The constant scrutiny transformed ordinary activities, like going to the grocery store or picking up mail, into running a gauntlet of questions and cameras. Local businesses found themselves overwhelmed by the sudden influx of visitors. The small motels filled up with reporters and curiosity seekers. Restaurants struggled to handle crowds they'd never anticipated, and the phone system was jammed with calls from around the world. Some business owners welcomed the unexpected revenue, while others resented the disruption to their normal routines. The Walton family bore the brunt of the attention. Their phone rang constantly. Reporters camped outside their home, and every family member found themselves the subject of intense scrutiny. Travis's mother, Mary, tried to shield her son from the worst of it, but there was no escape from the public fascination with his story. Travis himself struggled with his newfound notoriety. He was still recovering from whatever had happened to him, still trying to process memories that seemed more like dreams than reality. The constant pressure to retell his story, to answer skeptical questions, to defend his honesty and sanity, added layers of stress to an already traumatic situation. School children in Snowflake found themselves caught in the middle of adult debates about truth and reality. Some were proud that their small town had become the center of world attention, while others were embarrassed by the spectacle. Teachers struggled to maintain normal classroom routines while addressing students' questions about aliens and spaceships and what it all meant. The controversy even reached into the business community. Some people refused to hire Travis or do business with his family, viewing them as either liars or dangerously deluded. Others went out of their way to show support, making a point of hiring Travis for odd jobs or patronizing businesses that employed his relatives. Local law enforcement found itself in an impossible position. Sheriff Gillespie had to balance his duty to investigate the case thoroughly with the need to protect the Walton family from harassment. He assigned deputies to patrol their neighborhood, but there was little he could do about the constant phone calls and the reporters who seemed to multiply like rabbits. As weeks turned into months, the initial intensity of the media attention began to fade. But the changes to Snowflake were permanent. The small town had been thrust into the national spotlight in a way that altered its character forever. Some residents moved away, unable to cope with the ongoing attention and controversy. Others stayed, but withdrew from public life, tired of being asked about the Travis Walton thing whenever they traveled or met new people. The logging crew that had witnessed Travis's disappearance found their lives transformed as well. They had gone from being anonymous working men to reluctant celebrities, their names forever linked to one of the most controversial UFO cases in history. Some embraced the attention, appearing at conferences and giving interviews. Others retreated into privacy, wanting nothing more than to return to their quiet lives in the forest. But perhaps the most profound change was in the way people in Snowflake thought about the universe itself. Whether they believed Travis's story or not, everyone had been forced to confront the possibility that reality might be far stranger and more complex than they had ever imagined. The comfortable certainties of small-town life had been shaken, replaced by questions that had no easy answers. Late at night, when the reporters had gone home and the cameras were packed away, residents of Snowflake would sometimes look up at the star-filled sky above the Mogollon Rim and wonder what else might be out there, watching and waiting among the ancient light of distant suns. Chapter 14. Investigators and Skeptics. Within days of Travis's return, investigators from around the country began descending on Snowflake. The case had attracted attention from two very different communities: UFO researchers who saw it as potential evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, and skeptical investigators who viewed it as an opportunity to debunk what they considered an elaborate hoax or delusion. The UFO research community was represented by organizations like the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, and the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO. These groups had been documenting reported alien encounters for years, building databases of cases and looking for patterns that might prove the reality of extraterrestrial contact. The Travis Walton case was particularly compelling because it involved multiple witnesses and physical evidence in the form of a missing person. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who had coined the term close encounters of the third kind, took a personal interest in the case. Hynek had started his career as a UFO skeptic, working as a consultant for the Air Force's Project Blue Book. But years of investigating reports had gradually convinced him that some UFO cases deserved serious scientific attention. The Walton case, with its multiple credible witnesses and dramatic physical consequences, seemed to fit his criteria for genuine anomalous phenomena. APRO investigators conducted extensive interviews with Travis and the crew members, looking for details that might corroborate the story or reveal inconsistencies. They administered additional polygraph tests, hoping to verify the results of the earlier examinations. They also brought in medical experts to examine Travis for any physical evidence of his alleged experience. The medical examinations revealed some interesting findings. Travis had indeed lost significant weight during his absence, and his body showed signs of dehydration that were consistent with a limited food and water intake. But there were no obvious injuries, no unusual marks or implants that might indicate medical procedures. If he had been subjected to examination by alien beings, they had left no obvious physical trace. Psychological evaluations were more complex. Travis showed signs of post-traumatic stress that were consistent with having experienced something genuinely traumatic. But trauma could result from many different causes. His memories of the experience were vivid, but fragmentary, which could indicate either genuine recall of extraordinary events or the kind of confabulation that sometimes follows head injuries or psychological shock. On the skeptical side, investigators like Philip J. Klass, an aerospace journalist and prominent UFO debunker, arrived in Snowflake determined to expose what they believed was either fraud or self-deception. Klass had made a career of investigating UFO claims and finding conventional explanations for even the most seemingly compelling cases. Class and other skeptics focused on potential motives for hoax. The logging crew's financial problems with their Forest Service contract provided a possible reason for staging Travis's disappearance. It would force authorities to extend their deadline and potentially save them from costly penalties. The theory required believing that 8 men would conspire in an elaborate deception, but Class argued that the potential financial benefits made such a conspiracy plausible. The skeptical investigators also questioned the reliability of the polygraph tests. They pointed out that polygraph examinations are notoriously unreliable, especially when administered to people who might genuinely believe their own false memories. They also noted that Alan Dallas, the crew member who had produced inconclusive results, had never been retested with a more experienced examiner. One of the most controversial aspects of the skeptical investigation involved the National Enquirer, the tabloid newspaper that had offered a substantial reward for proof of UFO activity. The Enquirer had become involved in the Walton case early on, providing funding for additional polygraph tests and offering payment for exclusive interview rights. Skeptics argued that this financial incentive might have influenced the witnesses to maintain their story, even if they had initially intended it as a temporary deception. But the skeptics faced their own challenges in explaining the case. If this was a hoax, it required an extraordinary level of coordination among the witnesses. The men would have had to hide Travis for nearly a week, coordinate their stories down to minute details, and maintain their deception under intense scrutiny from law enforcement, reporters, and investigators. None of them had any background in acting or deception, and several were known in their community as particularly honest, straightforward individuals. The skeptics also struggled to explain Travis's physical condition upon his return. If he had been hiding voluntarily, where had he been? How had he lost so much weight so quickly? Why did he appear genuinely traumatized and confused? The theory that he had simply been camping in the woods didn't account for his physical state or his apparent disorientation about the passage of time. Some skeptical investigators proposed alternative explanations that didn't require conspiracy. Perhaps Travis had suffered a head injury when he approached the object in the forest, which might have been a conventional aircraft or some kind of electrical phenomenon. Confused and possibly suffering from amnesia, he might have wandered in the wilderness for days before finding his way to Haber. His memories of alien contact could be false recollections created by his injured brain to fill in the gaps in his actual experience. This theory had some appeal because it didn't require either fraud or alien visitation, but it had its own problems. Search teams had combed the area thoroughly without finding any trace of Travis. How could an injured man evade detection for nearly a week in terrain that professional searchers knew intimately? And why would his false memories be so detailed and consistent? The investigation became increasingly polarized as both sides dug in to defend their positions. UFO researchers found evidence that supported the reality of Travis's experience, while skeptics uncovered information that suggested alternative explanations. Neither side could prove their case conclusively, leaving the public to choose between competing narratives based on incomplete evidence. The media coverage reflected this polarization. Some outlets treated the case as a genuine mystery, worthy of serious investigation, while others portrayed it as either obvious fraud or harmless delusion. The sensational nature of the story made objective reporting difficult. Journalists faced pressure to take sides in a debate that seemed to allow no middle ground. As months passed and the initial furor died down, the case settled into the category of unresolved mysteries. Travis Walton continued to tell his story at UFO conferences and in interviews, maintaining his account despite ongoing skepticism. The crew members gradually returned to private life, though they remained available to researchers who wanted to re-examine their testimony. The investigators on both sides eventually moved on to other cases, but the Walton incident remained a touchstone in UFO research and skeptical investigation. It represented everything that was frustrating about the field: a case with compelling witness testimony and apparent physical evidence, but also clear motives for deception and alternative explanations that couldn't be definitively ruled out. The truth, whatever it might be, remained locked away in the memories of the men who claimed to have witnessed it, and in the silent forests where it allegedly occurred. The ancient pines of the Mogollon Rim continued their eternal vigil, indifferent to human debates about what was real and what was possible in a universe far stranger than most people dared to imagine. Part 5. Meaning and Echoes. Chapter 15. What Might Have Happened. Nearly 50 years after Travis Walton's disappearance and return, the case remains one of the most compelling and controversial in the annals of unexplained phenomena. Despite decades of investigation, analysis, and debate, no definitive explanation has emerged that satisfies all the evidence and addresses all the questions. Instead, we're left with several competing theories, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, each requiring us to make assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The most straightforward explanation, from a conventional standpoint, is that the entire incident was an elaborate hoax designed to solve the logging crew's financial problems with their Forest Service contracts. According to this theory, Travis went into hiding voluntarily, while his crewmates told their story about alien abduction, knowing that such extraordinary circumstances would force authorities to extend their deadline and waive any penalties for late completion. This explanation has several appealing features. It provides clear motives for the alleged deception, significant financial pressure that could have devastated multiple families. It accounts for the consistency of the witnesses' stories by assuming they were all part of the conspiracy. And it places the entire incident within the realm of normal human behavior, requiring no revision of our understanding of physics or biology. But the hoax theory also faces substantial challenges. It requires believing that 8 men, not known for their acting abilities or deceptive tendencies, could coordinate an elaborate lie and maintain it under intense scrutiny from law enforcement, media, and professional investigators. It fails to adequately explain Travis's physical condition upon his return, his apparent genuine trauma, or his disorientation about the passage of time. And it doesn't address why the conspirators would choose such an outlandish cover story, when conventional explanations for work delays would have been far easier to sell and maintain. A second conventional theory suggests that something genuinely traumatic happened to Travis, but not what he and his crewmates believe they witnessed. Perhaps Travis suffered a head injury when he approached what might have been a conventional aircraft, a weather balloon, or some kind of electrical phenomenon in the forest. Confused and possibly suffering from amnesia, he could have wandered in the wilderness for days before eventually finding his way to civilization. This explanation accounts for Travis's physical condition and apparent trauma, while avoiding both conspiracy and extraterrestrial contact. Traumatic brain injuries can indeed cause false memories, and the human mind's tendency to fill in gaps in recollection with plausible but incorrect information is well documented. The crew member's account of seeing him struck by a beam of light could represent a misinterpretation of conventional phenomena under stressful conditions and poor lighting. However, this theory struggles with the thoroughness of the search efforts. Professional teams with dogs and aircraft covered the area extensively without finding any trace of Travis. While it's possible for someone to evade detection in wilderness areas, it becomes increasingly unlikely when the search is as comprehensive as the one conducted in the Sitgreaves National Forest. The theory also doesn't explain why Travis's false memories would be so detailed and consistent, or why they would take such a specific form. A third possibility involves natural phenomena that science doesn't yet fully understand. The area around the Mogollon Rim is geologically active, with unusual electromagnetic properties that might create conditions for rare atmospheric or plasma phenomena. Ball lightning, electromagnetic anomalies, or other exotic natural events could potentially account for the strange lights and effects witnessed by the crew. Recent research into phenomena like sprites, elves, and other transient luminous events has revealed that Earth's atmosphere is capable of producing electrical displays far more varied and complex than previously understood. Some of these phenomena can affect electronic equipment, create unusual sounds, and even potentially influence human consciousness through electromagnetic effects on the brain. This natural phenomena theory could explain the unusual lights and effects without requiring either hoax or extraterrestrial intervention. Travis's disappearance and altered state upon return might result from exposure to intense electromagnetic fields or other exotic environmental factors. His memories of alien contact could be hallucinations or false recollections created by neurological disruption. But even this explanation faces challenges. Known natural phenomena don't typically last long enough or remain stable enough to account for the extended interaction described by the witnesses. And while electromagnetic effects can influence human consciousness, they don't usually cause people to vanish completely for nearly a week. This brings us to the fourth possibility, that Travis Walton's account is essentially accurate, that he was indeed taken aboard an extraterrestrial craft and returned after several days of examination and observation. This explanation has the advantage of taking the witness's testimony at face value and accounting for all the reported details without requiring additional assumptions about misperception, false memory, or conspiracy. The extraterrestrial hypothesis fits patterns reported in other alleged abduction cases. The description of the craft, the appearance and behavior of the beings, the medical examinations, and the apparent interest in human physiology and psychology. Travis's account includes details that weren't widely known in UFO literature at the time, suggesting either genuine experience or remarkably prescient fabrication. But accepting this explanation requires fundamental revisions to our understanding of physics, biology, and our place in the universe. It assumes not only that extraterrestrial intelligence exists, but that it possesses technology far beyond our current understanding and has chosen to interact with humans in ways that are both subtle and dramatic. It also raises difficult questions about why such beings would reveal themselves to some people, but not others, and why they would allow witnesses to remember and report their experiences. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that we simply don't know what happened in the Sitgreaves National Forest on November 5th, 1975. Each proposed explanation requires us to make assumptions that stretch our understanding of human nature, natural phenomena, or universal possibilities. The case remains genuinely mysterious, not because we lack theories to explain it, but because none of the available theories adequately account for all the evidence. What we can say with certainty is that something extraordinary occurred that night. Something that transformed the lives of everyone involved and challenged our collective assumptions about the nature of reality. Whether that something was human deception, natural phenomena beyond our current understanding, or contact with intelligence from beyond our world, it reminds us that the universe may be far stranger and more complex than our everyday experience suggests. The ancient pines of the Mogollon Rim have witnessed countless sunrises and storms, countless generations of human activity in their shadows. They continue to stand in their eternal silence, holding whatever secrets the forest may contain, indifferent to our human need for certainty and explanation. Perhaps that's as it should be. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, reminding us that there are still questions worth asking and wonders worth contemplating in our increasingly mapped and measured world. Chapter 16. Personal Aftermath. The years following November 5th, 1975, were not kind to the men who claimed to have witnessed Travis Walton's disappearance. What should have been a temporary disruption to their quiet lives became a permanent transformation that affected their families, friendships, and futures in ways none of them could have anticipated. For Travis himself, the burden of his experience was both public and intensely personal. He found himself thrust into a role he'd never sought, reluctant spokesperson for one of the most controversial cases in UFO history. The young man who had once enjoyed quiet evenings reading science fiction found his own life had become stranger than any story he'd ever imagined. The psychological impact was profound. Travis struggled with what psychologists call existential isolation, the lonely knowledge that his experience had separated him from normal, human reality in a way that few people could understand or accept. Even those who believed his story couldn't truly comprehend what it meant to have your fundamental assumptions about the universe shattered in such a dramatic way. Sleep became difficult. Travis found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, reliving fragments of memories that felt simultaneously real and impossible. The trauma wasn't just from what had allegedly happened to him aboard the craft. It was from the constant need to defend his sanity and honesty to a skeptical world. Every interview, every retelling of his story, forced him to revisit experiences that part of him would have preferred to forget. Relationships were particularly challenging. How do you explain to a potential romantic partner that you're the Travis Walton, the man who claims to have been abducted by aliens? Some people were drawn to him because of his notoriety, which created its own problems. Others were frightened away by the controversy surrounding his name. Finding someone who could see past the legend to the actual person became a lifelong struggle. Employment opportunities were limited. Despite his skills as a logger and general laborer, many potential employers were reluctant to hire someone associated with such an unusual story. Some viewed him as a liar seeking attention, others as mentally unstable, and still others simply wanted to avoid the media attention that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Travis found himself taking odd jobs, working for people who either believed his story or didn't care about it. The financial aspects were complex. While Travis eventually wrote a book about his experience and appeared at UFO conference for speaking fees, these activities never provided substantial income. The myth that abduction claimants get rich from their stories proved false in his case. The market for such accounts was smaller and less lucrative than skeptics assumed. Mike Rogers, the crew leader who had made the decision to work late that November evening, carried his own burden of responsibility. He wondered endlessly whether different choices might have prevented the entire incident. If they had quit work earlier, if he had refused to stop when they saw the light, if he had prevented Travis from getting out of the truck, would his friend's life have taken a different path? The stress affected Rogers' health and relationships. His marriage struggled under the pressure of constant scrutiny and the ongoing controversy. Like Travis, he found that his association with the case limited his employment opportunities in the tight-knit logging community. Some people respected his willingness to stand by his story despite the personal cost, while others viewed him as either deluded or dishonest. The other crew members, Ken Peterson, John Goulet, Steve Pierce, Dwayne Smith, and Alan Dallas, each dealt with the aftermath in their own ways. Some embraced their role as witnesses to an extraordinary event, appearing at conferences and giving interviews when requested. Others retreated from public attention, wanting nothing more than to return to their previous anonymity. The bonds between the crew members were both strengthened and strained by their shared experience. On one hand, they were the only people who truly understood what each had been through, the trauma of witnessing something impossible, the stress of investigation and interrogation, the burden of being forever associated with a controversial case. But the ongoing attention also created tensions, as different members had different comfort levels with publicity and different ways of processing their experience. Some crew members reported ongoing, unusual experiences after November 1975. Strange dreams, unexplained phenomena around their homes, a persistent feeling of being watched or monitored. Whether these experiences were related to their encounter in the forest, psychological after effects of trauma, or simply heightened awareness due to their changed worldview, they added another layer of complexity to their lives. The families of all involved struggled with their own challenges. Spouses had to decide whether they believed their husband's account and how to handle the social consequences of that belief. Children grew up knowing their father was associated with one of the most famous UFO cases in history. Sometimes a source of pride, sometimes embarrassment, always a factor that set their family apart from others. Mary Walton, Travis's mother, became a fierce defender of her son's honesty and character. She endured years of phone calls from reporters, researchers, and curiosity seekers, always maintaining that her son was telling the truth about what had happened to him. The stress of protecting her family while dealing with ongoing public attention took its toll on her health and well-being. The extended Walton family was also affected. Travis's siblings found themselves defined by their relationship to him, their own identities overshadowed by his notoriety. Some embraced the association, while others distanced themselves from the controversy. Family gatherings sometimes became tense when the subject of the incident arose, dividing relatives who might otherwise have remained close. Decades later, the men involved in the case found that their experience had become a defining element of their identities, whether they wanted it to be or not. They were forever the Travis Walton crew, the witnesses to one of the most documented alleged alien encounters in history. Some made peace with this legacy, while others continued to struggle with the unwanted attention it brought. The psychological literature on trauma suggests that extraordinary experiences, whether positive or negative, can create lasting changes in personality and worldview. The crew members certainly fit this pattern. Most reported that their encounter had made them more open to possibilities they had previously dismissed, more aware of the vastness and mystery of the universe, and more humble about the limits of human knowledge. But they also described a sense of isolation that came from having experienced something that most people considered impossible. They were members of an exclusive club that no one wanted to join. People whose lives had been forever altered by contact with the unknown. As the years passed, and some of the original crew members aged and died, the survivors found themselves carrying not just their own memories of that November evening, but the responsibility of preserving the testimony of their deceased friends. They became living repositories of a story that might otherwise be dismissed as historical curiosity. The impact extended beyond the immediate participants to the broader community of Snowflake and surrounding areas. The incident became part of local folklore, a story that was passed down through generations with varying degrees of belief and embellishment. Local businesses learned to capitalize on the notoriety, and the case became a part of the area's identity, whether residents welcomed that association or not. Chapter 17. Fire in the Sky. In 1993, nearly 18 years after the incident that changed his life, Travis Walton watched as Hollywood transformed his story into a major motion picture. Fire in the Sky, directed by Robert Lieberman and starring D.B. Sweeney as Travis, brought the case to a new generation of audiences who might never have heard of the events in the Sitgreaves National Forest. The film represented both validation and distortion for Travis and the other witnesses. On one hand, having their story adapted for the big screen was a form of recognition. Hollywood doesn't typically invest millions of dollars in projects based on events that executives consider completely fictitious. The very existence of the movie suggested that their account had achieved a level of cultural significance that transcended the UFO research community. But adaptation inevitably means interpretation, and interpretation means change. The filmmakers, while consulting with Travis during the production process, made dramatic choices that prioritized cinematic impact over documentary accuracy. The result was a movie that captured the emotional essence of the experience while altering many of the specific details that Travis considered crucial to understanding what had actually happened. The most significant changes involved Travis's account of his time aboard the craft. In his actual testimony, Travis described beings who, while alien, showed him what seemed like consideration or even kindness. The human-like figures who showed him the star map and gave him food treated him more like a guest than a prisoner. His experience, while traumatic due to its strangeness and his separation from everything familiar, wasn't characterized by deliberate cruelty or torture. The movie, however, emphasized the horror aspects of alien abduction narratives that had become popular in UFO literature and other films. The beings in Fire in the Sky were more threatening, more clinical, and more obviously hostile to their human subject. Travis's experience aboard the craft was portrayed as a nightmarish medical examination rather than the more complex encounter he actually described. These changes were understandable from a filmmaking perspective. Horror and suspense are easier to convey visually than wonder and confusion, and audiences expect certain dramatic beats from science fiction thrillers. But for Travis, seeing his life-changing experience transformed into conventional movie monsters was both frustrating and painful. The film's portrayal of the crew members and their relationships was similarly altered for dramatic effect. The screenplay emphasized conflict and suspicion among the men, suggesting deeper tensions and hidden motives that hadn't existed in reality. Characters were given backstories and motivations that served the movie's narrative structure, but didn't reflect the actual personalities and relationships of the real people involved. Mike Rogers, in particular, felt that his portrayal in the film was unfair and inaccurate. The movie suggested that he had financial motives that made him a suspect in Travis's disappearance, emphasizing the contract deadline pressure while minimizing his genuine concern for his friend and crew member. The real Rogers had cooperated fully with investigators and had shown no signs of deception or ulterior motives. Despite these concerns, the crew members generally supported the film project. They understood that Hollywood adaptation inevitably involves compression and dramatization, and they were grateful for the opportunity to bring their story to a wider audience. The movie introduced the Travis Walton case to millions of people who might never have encountered it otherwise, sparking new interest in both the specific incident and the broader questions it raised about the possibility of extraterrestrial contact. The film's production also provided an opportunity for Travis to revisit the original location with the filmmakers. Returning to the site of his experience for the first time in years was emotionally challenging. The forest looked the same, but his memories of that evening remained as vivid and troubling as ever. Standing in the clearing, where he claimed to have encountered the craft, surrounded by film equipment and actors, created a surreal juxtaposition between past trauma and present commercialization. Fire in the Sky was moderately successful at the box office and has remained popular with science fiction fans in the decades since its release. For many viewers, it represents their primary introduction to the Travis Walton case, which means that their understanding of the events is filtered through Hollywood's interpretation rather than the actual testimony of the witnesses. This has created ongoing challenges for Travis and the other crew members. When they appear at conferences or give interviews, they often need to distinguish between what actually happened and what was depicted in the movie. Audience members frequently ask about scenes or details from the film that weren't part of the real experience, requiring constant clarification about the differences between fact and fiction. The movie also influenced subsequent accounts of alien abduction in popular culture. Its visual representation of extraterrestrial beings and their technology became part of the standard imagery associated with such encounters, creating a feedback loop where later claims were influenced by cinematic depictions that were themselves based on earlier testimonies. For Travis personally, the film represented a complex milestone in his ongoing relationship with his own experience. On one hand, it brought his story to a global audience and provided some financial compensation for years of unwanted notoriety. On the other hand, it created a new layer of distortion around events that he was still trying to understand and process decades after they occurred. The success of Fire in the Sky also renewed media interest in the case, leading to new interviews, documentaries, and investigations. Some of this attention was welcome. It provided opportunities for Travis to tell his story in his own words and correct misconceptions that had accumulated over the years. But it also meant continued intrusion into his private life and ongoing pressure to relive traumatic memories for public consumption. Critics of the Travis Walton case sometimes point to the movie deal as evidence that the entire incident was motivated by financial gain. They argue that the potential for book sales, speaking fees, and film rights provided incentives for maintaining a false story long after it should have been abandoned. Travis and his supporters counter that the movie deal came nearly 2 decades after the incident, far too late to serve as an original motive, and that the financial benefits have been modest compared to the personal costs of his notoriety. The film also raised questions about the ethics of adapting controversial real-life events for entertainment purposes. Critics argued that dramatizing unproven claims about alien contact legitimized beliefs that weren't supported by scientific evidence. Supporters countered that the movie clearly presented itself as entertainment rather than documentary fact, and that audiences were capable of distinguishing between fiction and reality. Today, Fire in the Sky remains one of the most widely recognized depictions of alleged alien abduction in popular culture. For better or worse, it has shaped public understanding of the Travis Walton case and contributed to ongoing debates about the reality of extraterrestrial contact. The film serves as a reminder that once a story enters the realm of popular culture, its meaning and impact extend far beyond the original experiences of the people who lived it. Chapter 18. The Forest Endures. Decades have passed since that November evening in 1975, and the Sitgreaves National Forest remains largely unchanged. The same ponderosa pines that witnessed whatever occurred that night continue their slow growth toward the sky, adding rings of wood that mark the passage of seasons, indifferent to human drama. The forest roads still wind through the same canyons and over the same ridges, though they're better maintained now, and GPS has replaced the intimate knowledge of landmarks that old-time loggers carried in their heads. Travis Walton has returned to the site numerous times over the years, sometimes alone, sometimes with researchers or filmmakers, occasionally with family members who wanted to see the place that changed his life so dramatically. Each visit brings its own emotional challenges. The forest is simultaneously familiar and alien, comforting and unsettling, ordinary and charged with significance that exists nowhere else on Earth. The location itself is unremarkable. Turkey Springs Road looks like thousands of other Forest Service roads throughout the American West. A dirt track that serves logging operations and recreation activities, bordered by dense stands of pine and oak, occasionally opening into small meadows where wildflowers bloom in spring and early summer. There's no monument marking the spot, no sign indicating its significance in UFO history. To the casual observer, it's simply another pretty stretch of Arizona wilderness. But for Travis, standing in that clearing brings back sensory memories that remain as vivid as they were 47 years ago. The scent of pine resin, the quality of light filtering through the trees, the particular way sound carries in the thin mountain air. All of these trigger recollections of that evening when his understanding of reality was fundamentally altered. On some visits, Travis has brought electromagnetic field detectors and other equipment, hoping to find some lingering trace of whatever phenomenon he encountered. The results have been inconclusive. Occasional anomalous readings that could indicate residual effects, or could simply reflect the normal variations in natural electromagnetic fields that occur in geologically active areas. The forest keeps its secrets well. Other researchers have studied the site extensively over the decades. Soil samples have been analyzed for unusual isotopes or chemical compositions that might indicate exposure to exotic energy sources. Ground-penetrating radar has been used to search for buried metallic objects or unusual geological formations. Geologists have mapped the area's mineral composition and magnetic properties, looking for natural phenomena that might explain unusual lights or electromagnetic effects. The scientific investigations have revealed that the area does have some interesting characteristics. The geological structure includes quartz deposits that could potentially generate piezoelectric effects under the right conditions. The local magnetic field shows variations that could affect compass readings and sensitive electronic equipment. The topography creates microclimates and atmospheric conditions that could potentially support unusual optical phenomena under specific weather conditions. But none of these natural features definitively explain what Travis and his crew claimed to have witnessed. They provide possible alternative explanations for some aspects of the reported encounter, but they don't account for the specific details of the witness's testimony or the physical effects that Travis displayed upon his return. The passage of time has brought changes to the broader area, though the immediate location remains largely pristine. Snowflake has grown somewhat, though it retains its small-town character. New housing developments have been built on what were once remote ranch properties, and improved roads make the area more accessible to tourists and recreationalists. The logging industry has evolved with changing environmental regulations and market conditions, though timber operations continue throughout the national forest. Some changes reflect the ongoing interest in the Travis Walton case. UFO researchers and curiosity seekers regularly visit the area, and local businesses have learned to capitalize on the notoriety. Gift shops sell books and souvenirs related to the case, and local guides offer tours of the alleged encounter site. The incident has become part of the area's identity, whether longtime residents welcome that association or not. The crew members who are still alive occasionally return to the site as well, though less frequently than Travis. For them, The location represents not just a place where something extraordinary allegedly occurred, but the spot where their lives were forever changed by an experience they never sought and still struggle to understand. Mike Rogers, now in his 70s, has visited the site with his adult children, trying to help them understand the event that shaped their father's life and their family's history. Standing in the clearing where he watched his friend disappear, Rogers sometimes wonders how different all their lives might have been if he had made different choices that evening, if he had decided to quit work earlier, if he had driven past the strange light without stopping, if he had prevented Travis from getting out of the truck. The site also attracts skeptics and debunkers who come hoping to find evidence that supports conventional explanations for the reported events. They've measured sight lines and lighting conditions, analyzed the acoustics of the area, and documented every possible natural or man-made phenomenon that could have been misinterpreted by stressed witnesses working in poor visibility conditions. But the forest remains neutral in these debates. It offers no definitive answers, no smoking gun evidence that would conclusively prove any particular theory about what happened on November 5th, 1975. The trees that stood witness to whatever occurred that night continue their silent growth, indifferent to human needs for certainty and closure. Wildlife has returned to normal patterns in the area, if indeed they were ever disturbed. Elk still move through the meadows in their seasonal migrations. Black bears forage for berries and nuts, and mountain lions follow ancient hunting trails through the timber. The ecosystem functions according to natural rhythms that predate human presence in the region and will likely continue long after our species has moved on to other concerns. The changing seasons mark time in ways that dwarf human drama. Snow falls and melts, wildflowers bloom and fade, leaves turn gold and drift to the forest floor. Each autumn brings the same crisp air and slanting light that characterized the evening when Travis Walton's life was forever changed. But the forest doesn't distinguish between one November day and another. Occasionally, visitors report unusual experiences at the site. Strange lights, electromagnetic anomalies, unexplained sounds or sensations. Whether these represent genuinely anomalous phenomena, the power of suggestion, or simply the human tendency to find significance in random events is impossible to determine. The forest accepts all interpretations equally, offering its ancient silence as the only response to human questions about meaning and truth. As climate change and human development continue to alter landscapes. Throughout the American West, the Sitgreaves National Forest faces its own challenges and changes. But for now, the trees that may have witnessed one of the most extraordinary events in modern UFO history continue to stand in their patient vigil, guardians of secrets that may never be fully revealed or understood. The dirt road that carried 7 men home from work on that fateful evening still winds through the same forest, though now it's traveled by different vehicles, carrying different people with different purposes. Some come seeking answers to questions about the nature of reality itself. Others come simply to experience the profound quiet of a wilderness area that seems somehow charged with possibility and mystery. Whatever happened in this forest on November 5th, 1975, the place itself endures, indifferent to human interpretation, but somehow enriched by the mystery that has become part of its identity. The ancient pines continue their slow conversation with wind and weather, holding whatever secrets they may possess in the patient silence that has characterized this place since long before humans arrived to give names to its wonders and its mysteries. Epilogue. The long drive home. Night has fallen once again over the Mogollon Rim, and the forest settles into the deep quiet that comes when civilization feels far away. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl calls to its mate, and the wind moves through pine branches with the same whisper it has carried for countless generations. The stars shine down through clear mountain air, the same stars that have watched over this landscape since long before humans arrived to wonder about their meaning. It's been nearly half a century since 7 men drove home from work along these forest roads and encountered something that challenged every assumption they held about the nature of reality. Whether what they experienced was a glimpse of contact with intelligence from beyond our world, a natural phenomenon beyond our current understanding, or something else entirely. Their story has become part of the larger human conversation about our place in the universe. Travis Walton, now in his 70s, continues to tell his story to those willing to listen. The young logger who once dreamed about the possibilities hidden among distant stars has lived to see his own life become the subject of international fascination and debate. He's endured decades of scrutiny, skepticism, and celebrity, all because of 5 days that he may never fully understand. The other surviving crew members have also carried their memories forward through the years, each processing the experience in his own way. Some have embraced their role as witnesses to the extraordinary, while others have retreated into privacy, content to let history judge the truth of what they claim to have seen. The forest itself remains the most neutral witness to whatever occurred that November evening. It offers no answers, no proof that would satisfy skeptics or believers conclusively. It simply endures, holding its secrets among the ancient pines, indifferent to human needs for certainty and explanation. Perhaps that's the most important lesson from the Travis Walton case, that mystery itself has value, that questions can be as meaningful as answers, and that the universe may be far stranger and more wonderful than our everyday experience suggests. In an age when we often assume that science and technology will eventually explain everything, the case reminds us that there are still phenomena at the edges of our understanding, still experiences that challenge our assumptions about what's possible. The story also speaks to deeper human truths about the courage required to maintain unpopular beliefs, the cost of being different in a conformist world, and the bonds that can form between people who share extraordinary experiences. Whether or not Travis Walton ever set foot aboard an extraterrestrial craft, his story illustrates the very real human drama that unfolds when ordinary people find themselves at the center of extraordinary claims. For those who venture into the Sitgreaves National Forest today, the possibility of encounter with the unknown, with the unexpected, with aspects of reality that don't fit neatly into conventional categories, remains part of the landscape's appeal. The forest continues to represent a place where the boundaries between the known and unknown remain permeable, where wonder and fear can coexist in the darkness between the trees. As you drive those same forest roads today, perhaps heading home after your own day of work or recreation, You might find yourself looking up at the stars, visible through your windshield, and wondering what else might be out there, watching and waiting among the infinite points of light that fill the night sky. You might consider the possibility that consciousness and intelligence take forms we haven't yet learned to recognize, that the universe is populated with beings whose motivations and methods remain as mysterious to us as our own would be to the other species that share our planet. The Travis Walton case ultimately asks us to consider what we would do if faced with evidence of something that challenged our fundamental assumptions about reality. Would we have the courage to report what we witnessed, knowing we might be ridiculed or disbelieved? Would we maintain our testimony in the face of decades of skepticism and scrutiny? Would we be willing to live with questions that might never be answered? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They reflect choices that real people have made, consequences that real families have lived with, and mysteries that continue to resonate through our collective consciousness. The case reminds us that truth is not always comfortable, that reality does not always conform to our expectations, and that the most important stories are often the ones that resist easy explanation. So as you settle in for sleep tonight, consider the vast darkness beyond your window, the countless stars burning in the cosmic deep, and the possibility that somewhere among them, intelligence gazes back toward our small blue world with purposes we cannot yet fathom. Consider the ancient forests that blanket our planet, holding secrets in their shadows, bearing witness to events both ordinary and extraordinary. Consider the possibility that mystery itself might be one of the universe's greatest gifts. Not a problem to be solved, but a reminder that reality extends far beyond the boundaries of our current understanding. In a cosmos filled with wonders we've barely begun to explore, the Travis Walton case suggests that the most profound encounters might occur not in laboratories or observatories, but in quiet clearings where ordinary people meet the extraordinary and are forever changed by the encounter. The forest sleeps now in its ancient patience, holding whatever secrets it may possess, waiting for whatever dawn might bring. The same stars that shone down on that November evening in 1975 continue their eternal dance across the sky, indifferent to human interpretation, but somehow enriched by our capacity to wonder, to question, and to dream about possibilities that extend far beyond the limits of our small, beautiful, mysterious world. And in that mystery, perhaps, lies the greatest truth of all, that the universe remains vast enough to contain wonders we cannot yet imagine, patient enough to reveal its secrets in its own time, and strange enough to ensure that there will always be new questions to ask and new horizons to explore, as long as there are curious minds willing to venture into the darkness and wonder what might be waiting there among the stars.